Welcome back to another edition of the Quantum Yoga Podcast. We've got Dr. Richard Hammerschlag today on the program, and he's the Director of Research at the Consciousness and Healing Initiative. That's QI for short. And my goodness, I just listened to a IONS presentation that you gave that you'd sent me over earlier, and I had no idea the depth and the breadth of research that you've gotten into in your work. And so I wonder if you can maybe give us an overview. And that section you took maybe 15 minutes to kind of discuss your leading all the way up to your work at QI. Could you maybe condense that into a couple of minutes?
Sure. How I got to be where I am. Anyway, it's a pleasure to chat with you about Biofield, which is my current passion, even though I am now retired. My path started fairly conventionally in research, in biomedical research, in neurobiology down in Southern California at the City of Hope Medical Center. And towards the end of, the 1970s, so that'll tell you roughly my age, I started to learn Tai Chi Chuan and was practicing outside my house one morning when I felt this severe pain starting from my hip and radiating down to the knee, and I thought I'd better slow up. And when that next kick came around that triggered it, the pain shot all the way down my foot, and I literally had to have a couple of friends come over and carry me back into my house. And when I was able to be a little bit mobile, I went and to a neurologist and various other, I got two independent physicians to look at me. And in those days, it was only X-ray as imaging. And they said, good news, there's nothing wrong with your spine. And I gritted my teeth and I said, well, what do I do about this pain? And they said, tell us what you want and we'll prescribe to knock it down. And of course I said, I don't want to just knock down the pain. I want to know what the problem is. And they said, doesn't show up on the X-ray, has to be a soft tissue problem. And that led to the woman who was assigned to me in my Tai Chi class calling and saying, where have you been? You were doing pretty well. How come you dropped out? And I told her what the problem was in my pain, and she laughed and she said, okay, Mr. Western Scientist, it's time for acupuncture. Well, I had, of course, known what acupuncture was. I had no experience with it, and she came and picked me up and took me to her acupuncturist, and when I walked into his office, I saw this elderly gentleman watching Sesame Street on television and was later to kid him about it as we became friends. And he said, yes, that was a great way for him to begin to learn English. Anyway, that first acupuncture treatment was amazing and eye-opening to me. And of course, there's no treatment that works for everybody, for every condition, but Chinese medicine seems to know where to put the needles when sciatica, which was my diagnosis, is not due to a spinal problem, not due to a slip disc pressing on the nerve. It's usually due to a buttocks muscle spasming. And they know where to put the needle to get that muscle to relax so the muscle stops pressing on the nerve and you don't get that radiating pain down your leg. One thing I'll just add, which was irony in my life, that I should get sciatica because one of the main studies we were doing in my neurobiology lab was understanding how proteins, after they're synthesized, travel down the long axons of nerves and get to where they're going to function. So we were using the sciatic nerve of bullfrogs, and I knew that my sciatica at some level was the revenge of the bullfrogs. But it had the other amazing beneficial effect of leading me to acupuncture and eventually to a career change. This was at a time when the endorphins had just been discovered, And there was wonderful research that quickly came out both from Beijing and from the University of Toronto, suggesting that at least the aspect of acupuncture causing analgesia, suppressing pain, was due to the release of these endogenous opioids, these endogenous substances generally called the endorphins. So that led to my first career change from biomedical research to acupuncture research. And eventually I got invited up to Portland, where I am now, to start a research department at the Acupuncture College. And I think in acupuncture, it really triggered my interest in what parts of acupuncture could not be explained by Western medicine, didn't seem to have correlates. Things like intention. Chinese medicine says there's a very important part of needling which doesn't have to do with putting the needle in and having the needle engage with whatever cellular endpoints it finds there. But there's something in addition called intention, which the Chinese call Y-I. E is intention. Then I found out that there's a kind of Japanese-style needling called Toyohari. And Toyohari was developed by blind acupuncturists in Japan, and it involves not penetrating the skin, but putting the needle either barely touching the skin or often holding the needle above the acupuncture point on the skin, and the practitioner sending their intention through the needle to the acupuncture point. So those were two things that got my attention. And then I learned about this form of Qigong that isn't done by yourself, that's done by a practitioner called external Qigong, which now we call one of a family of Biofield therapies. So Reiki, external Qigong, healing touch, therapeutic touch are all called Biofield therapies, which are going to get us into talking about Biofield itself. What do you think, Jonathan? How should we begin to talk about that?
Yeah, take us right in.
Intention, Toyohari, needling, external Qigong have all been proposed to interact with one or more so-called human biofields. So what are biofields? I think the term was probably first generally introduced, certainly to the scientific community, at an NIH conference when they first, in the early 1990s, when they were first dealing with complementary and alternative medicine, when Congress forced the NIH, literally mandated the NIH to begin what was first called the Office of Alternative Medicine. And then in the late 90s, Congress upgraded that office to a center, the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine. But initially, they needed to group what the modalities were under that general title of complementary and alternative medicine. And one of the areas that they defined were biofield therapies. So what's a biofield, and what are biofield therapies? I know you've had Jim Oshman and Shamini Jan on your program, so hopefully your listeners have some familiarity with the concept. But just as a quick review, biofields, first of all, are non-molecular, but they are physiological regulators. Mainly, I would say, electromagnetic, but also acoustic. There's evidence that fields of sound in the body and fields of light produced by biophotons, tiny light particles that are released as part of normal metabolism that turn out not to be just byproducts, but actually physiological information systems in themselves. Stay tuned and follow the concept of biophotons. It's going to be fascinating. But I would say similar to molecular mechanisms, and they work together, the molecular information systems with the biofield systems. Similar to molecular mechanisms, biofields are generated by the body, of course, and they're involved in normal physiological regulation, and they carry information. So biofields, by other names, have really been known for quite a while, certainly clinically. The electroencephalogram, the EEG, and the electrocardiogram, the ECG from the heart, are biofields. They are fields. The heart has the strongest magnetic field of any part of the body, and only experimentally now it hasn't been quite perfected enough to use clinically, but the devices now are strong enough so that you can get all the information about normal heart function without putting electrode onto the surface of the body. But you can now detect all of the usual information about heart function from several feet off the body. This work is being done in Central California at the what is it? I'm just blocking on the name of it. The Heart Math Institute in Central California. So biofields are clinically diagnostic, and biofields are what we believe are modified by many types of healers, specifically, of course, biofield therapists, the Reiki masters and the external Qigong masters, and there's fairly now widespread use of healing touch, for example, in hospital settings. Healing touch has been used in the operating room. It's found to reduce interoperational bleeding. It's found to reduce the days in post-op care. So very effective. And I think the term biofield really offers a bridge between traditional and contemporary explanations of energy medicine. So if you'd like me to keep going, I think a really important distinction that I like to make, and a lot of other of my colleagues are not as on board with it as I am, but I think it's really important, certainly at this stage of trying to bring biofield into the mainstream, is to distinguish between what Tim Oshman calls big B biofield, biofield singular with a capital B, because that term conjures up, at least to me, the idea of aura or of vital energy, which terms have a lot of baggage, both New Age baggage and types of thinking and approach that Western medicine basically holds up the cross to keep the vampires away about this whole idea of vital energy. So that's why I don't like to use the term biofield, big B, but I prefer to talk about small b biofields in the plural. So there's a biofield from the heart. There's biofields that are generated by biophotons. Certainly the collection of neurons close to the surface of the brain generate the EEG. That's a biofield. And what we're doing as we define these individual biofields more and more, we're paving the way to eventually see how these biofields interact. And maybe we'll get to the point where we can talk about a big B biofield. So that's an overview of the biofield. And maybe the next thing to go into, Jonathan, is just a bit of the evidence for these guys, these biofields. Yeah, because the first question always is, does acupuncture work? Do biofield therapies work? And it's a very different question when you're in a scientific, and I'm a Gemini, I have to admit, and so I love straddling the two, the clinical side and the research side, or the Eastern approach and the Western approach, or whatever. I've often found myself happily straddling the two sides of a question, or the two perspectives on a question too. So I think a good place to begin is asking, as I said, do biofield therapies work? And this is not from the perspective of a Reiki master who will tell you all kinds of anecdotal evidence. And one of the directors of this National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine, which now has a new name because integrative medicine is now in vogue. But Steve Schwartz, who was the director of NCAM for quite a while, used to say the plural of anecdote is not data. And I never liked this, because anecdotes are really important. Anecdotes in medicine, it's the first time you see something behave oddly, behave different from what's been in the medical textbook, behave differently from what your clinical experience is. You want to pay attention to it and see if it comes up again, if you get this abnormal response again from a different patient. And then that suggests a hypothesis. And that's what clinical research thrives on, is interesting hypotheses. So we're going to ask now, do biofield therapies work from the perspective of clinical research? So my colleague in CHI, the Consciousness and Healing Initiative in San Diego, Shamini Jain, in 2010 published the first really definitive systematic review of all of the research that's been done on biofield therapies, as I said before, on Reiki, on healing touch, therapeutic touch, on Jo Ray, on Reiki and external Qigong. And they found, that's now published, and they found that there was pretty substantial evidence that biofield therapies looked at as a whole, and pain conditions looked at as a whole, that there is good evidence that biofield therapies can reduce pain. Now, of course, nobody knows what a dose of a biofield therapy is, so it's very hard to repeat these kind of studies exactly. So it's better at this stage to look at all the studies together, even though they're done for different lengths of time with different patient populations, just as a first throw the net broadly and see, is there enough evidence, and then you can zero in. So when I first saw her review, Jane and Mills, if anyone wants to look it up, in 2010, when I first saw the review, from my perspective, I think that was an excellent way to start. But in clinical practice, many of these biofield therapies are done, for those of you who've had Reiki or Qigong treatment, you know that they're done partly hands-on, touching you, and partly hands-off, sensing the energy fields and where there are blockages or stagnations. And my question was, if I'm really interested in these non-physical ways of healing, were there any studies done where they only used non-physical contact? I don't want to say non-physical touch, because what is touch? I mean, touch is with our fingers, but touch can also be in these other ways with your intention, for example. We can call that a different kind of touch. So in 2014, we finally published a study that took quite a while to do, where we had to read through each of those clinical trials of the biofield therapies to see which ones stated clearly that they only used non-physical contact. So out of 90, which is a substantial amount of work, 90 individual, what are called RCTs, randomized clinical trials of biofield therapies, 28 of the 90 we found reported that they only used non-physical contact. Some of them were interesting where they compared physical contact with non-physical contact for external Qigong. But others worked on burn patients, for example, or neonates, where you would best not use physical touch. So, as I said, there were 28 studies that were published that used only non-physical contact. So then when you do a systematic review, you don't automatically accept all of the studies you find to review, because you apply a set of criteria. You want these studies, the important thing in research is for someone else to be able to repeat the study and hopefully repeat your findings. And so you are required to report, to write up in your paper all the key aspects of what you did. And when studies left out important parts of what they did, so we really couldn't tell how they did the study, we dropped those studies from our final analysis. So of the 28, 10 didn't meet our standards for reporting what they did. So we were left with 18 studies, and of those, 12 reported at least one measure of health that showed statistically significant improvement. So we concluded carefully, and most of these studies, unfortunately, use relatively small numbers of patients. They were what is generally called pilot studies. So it's very difficult to find the funds to do large studies, but that's what's needed now. So our guarded conclusion was, yes, there is evidence that non-physical touch can improve health in a variety of conditions, so that you don't need physical touch. So, of course, biomedicine has some idea, some suggested mechanisms for how even light touch can cause benefit, clinical benefit, through release of hormones. Oxytocin, for example, is a major, that's the bonding hormone between mother and baby. But light touch releases oxytocin. There are some specific sensory nerve endings that will respond to light touch that are likely to be involved in healing from massage, in addition to the deep work on the muscles and the surrounding organ systems. But what we wanted to know was, does non-physical touch also, can it be shown to be effective? And what our review said was yes. Okay, so then the question is, how does that work? How can you get healing without physical touch? Western biomedicine doesn't have any answers to that. So how do we begin? Here's the big question, Donovan. How do we begin to view our bodies from a biofield perspective? So one way is to think, okay, we know that hormones, other biochemicals or drugs act through receptors, protein molecules on the surface of many cells, and that there are also types of hormones, for example, the steroid hormones that are involved in the stress response. Steroid hormones are what we call lipophilic or fat-soluble, so those can go right through the cell membrane, and they act on receptors that are right on the DNA in the nucleus to cause specific genes to, what we say, upregulate. And the question then is there any evidence that specific frequencies of electromagnetic frequencies that can be, for example, produced from a device onto cells in cell culture or tissue culture, to see if there's any evidence that electromagnetic frequencies can also have effects on cells. And so an excellent set of groundbreaking studies were done by Martin Blank and his colleagues at Columbia University. And they found, in fact, that when you treat cells in culture with specific, very low frequency electromagnetic fields, the same level and the same low frequencies that are detected from the body itself, when you treat them externally, certain select genes get turned on. So now with the wonders of molecular biology, you can actually isolate the DNA from those cells, and you can snip off the part of those of the DNA that's upstream, as we say, that comes right before, if you think of the DNA, which it's not, as beads on a string, but there's a part that's the gene itself for the particular protein that's going to be affected by the steroid molecule, and upstream from that is a receptor for the hormone itself. So just as we know that specific hormones will go and act on what are called response elements on the DNA, there appear to be other response elements for electromagnetic frequencies. And the best way we know this is once you snip off that hypothetical electromagnetic response element, you can anneal it, you can paste it onto another gene upstream from another gene that normally doesn't respond to the electromagnetism. And now when you shine that same frequency on the cells, the new gene is upregulated. So there's tantalizing preliminary evidence that cells do respond to electromagnetic fields and that these act in parallel with molecular responses. Ooh, I hope that wasn't too detailed.
No, actually, I'd love to hang around in this theme for a little while.
Sure.
I love what you're talking about here.
Okay, so then biofields are proposed to act at every level of the body, at the tissue level, the brain and the heart, at the cellular level, and even at the molecular level. And here, as my PhD is in biochemistry, so I can get away with saying this. But I think, well, let me start with something a little off the wall. Many of us have seen this rather amazing painting from René Magritte. I think he was Belgian, a surrealist painter. And the painting is a painting of a pipe. And what he's written on the painting is, ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe, right? Mm. So he loves to play around in his painting with our perceptions of what is reality. And in fact, his actual title for that painting, when I looked it up, is, and excuse my French pronunciation, La Trahison des Images, which in English is the treachery of images. So where am I going with this? Think of a molecule, and when we think of a molecule, even a water molecule or a molecule of glucose, or if you're a biochemistry nerd like I used to be, you could even think of a molecule of caffeine, for example, or of a drug. You will be picturing something that's an image with sticks and balls, and that way of modeling, of imaging a molecule, dates back to the mid-19th century in Europe, which was a very convenient way for people of modeling molecules because it reflected the Industrial Revolution at the time, the Industrial Revolution's focus on all things made from interchangeable parts. But I would like to figure out how to say in French, this is not a molecule. When you draw it with sticks and balls, a molecule is a vibrating, pulsing entity. It's a beautiful thing, and we're going to someday, I believe, find out that a hormone in the bloodstream doesn't find its receptor just by chance. It doesn't find its receptor by diffusion or what's called Brownian motion, which makes things jiggle a bit. There is going to be, and I would certainly make this prediction that someday we're going to understand a kind of homing pigeon mechanism whereby the receptor of a drug molecule, the receptor for a hormone, gives out a certain frequency which is matched by the frequency of this vibrating molecule. And the molecule finds its receptor by homing in. You can't have all of these molecules finding their way just by chance. I can't believe, given all of the millions of years that evolution has had to work its magic, that we're going to still be thinking that molecules find their receptors in the body just by chance. So what we say is there's that apocryphal saying where I've heard it attributed to Native American lore, but I've also heard it attributed to other things. But with the young Native American says to his father, so I understand our origin myth has the earth sitting on the back of a tortoise. But what is holding up that tortoise? And the father looks at him and says, another tortoise. And so the son, of course, says, and what's holding up that tortoise? And they go on, and finally comes up with this saying, of course, it's turtles all the way down. And so what we want to say is biofields all the way down. We have to start thinking of the whole body as this interacting, intermeshing web of biofields.
Let's go into biophoton communication. We've had a few guests talk about this, and like you said, it's a very exciting field that is getting a lot more attention to.
Yes.
And what can you tell us more about this?
Well, the theory, and there's very little research to support it, but what little research there is hinting at biophotons are a measure of health. And first of all, they are extremely low density of the biophotons given off from the body. And so it's much easier to study this again in cell cultures. But however you study it, you have to study it in a light, tight environment to be able to detect this low density of the biophotons that are given off. But nevertheless, if you take a whole population of cells that you've isolated and you put some in one petri dish and an identical number of cells in a second petri dish, the first petri dish you add a hormone to, or you add a particular broth to that has ions in it, and you make these cells do their thing. They'll start making a particular antibody in response to a foreign substance, for example. And lo and behold, what they find is that the cells in the second dish, where you haven't added the stimulus to, begin, although at a lower level, but they also begin to make that same response. And so there's no chemical connection between these two cells because they're in sets of cells, they're in separate petri dishes. So what they then can do, the experimenters, you can take various types of filters to put between the dishes, and some filters will allow visible light to pass through, but not ultraviolet light. Other filters will allow ultraviolet light or infrared, but not the other kinds of light to pass through. And you can really show that there are biophotons of particular wavelengths that appear to pass from one dish to the other to signal the non-stimulated cells to do what the stimulated cells are doing. So it's very early on with research in biophotons, but it's yet another area of biofield research that shows a lot of promise.
Who is doing that research?
A number of different groups. Probably the group that's best known is a father and son team. They're Dutch, the Van Wicks. They're called. I believe it's WIJK. Van Wyck is their surname, and they have really put the concept of biophotons on the map. Another major lab is that of Fritz Popp, P-O-P-P, in Germany. Those are the two labs that have started the work, and it's now been picked up by a number of other places around the world. My understanding is that some people have demonstrated light in the infrared. Others have demonstrated various types of visible frequencies of visible light. So it's not one particular frequency, not one particular part of the spectrum.
Okay.
So maybe, in the time we have left, we could talk a little broader about these biofields, because I think it's really important. If one aspect of these biofields that particularly is fascinating to me is the idea that what I call I don't end here. That, as we know, if we're going to be able to measure the biofield from the heart at several feet off the body, that means there really is preliminary evidence for fields, so that when you say to somebody, get out of my space, or you're pushing me too close, step back, there is a way that we really are aware of this at some level, that we are overlapping with each other's biofield. And I could tell you just a sort of very brief thread of this that I've been following, or it's been following me, one or the other, in my life. So what is the I? That's always the fascinating thing. I don't end here. What is this concept of I all about? And I remember when I was in graduate school, being fortunate to hear a lecture by Alan Watts, who was one of the major gurus of the early New Age. And Watts had been a preacher before he before he got turned on to Zen Buddhism and other aspects of spirituality, and he had this wonderful resonant voice. But in this lecture, he was talking about what he thought was the unfortunate aspects of us growing up in society with the idea, with the concept that the function of my body is to carry me around, so that the I is somewhere inside and my body protects me and carries me around. Watts called it the chauffeur theory of existence, that the body would carry me around. And he went on, he was developing his ideas for a little book he wrote called Psychotherapy, East and West, because he believed that this I being inside the body, this sense of separation and aloneness led to neuroses and psychoses in our society. Anyway, that made an impression on me. Clearly, I always remembered that part of his lecture. And then in the next decade, so we're now talking about the late 70s and early 80s, with the rise of the human potential movement, there were a lot of weekend seminars that we all went to, workshops. And one of them was very popular, was somebody named Ken Peltier. And his workshop, I remember, was called Mind as Healer, Mind as Slayer. And you can imagine what topics they talked about. But in the course of that weekend workshop, they talked about out-of-body experiences. And I'm a kind of control freak, I guess I would call it. And so I was fascinated by out-of-body experiences, but I was always worried that I was going to be the person who couldn't get back in, and I was going to be stuck out there, and who knows how I was thinking. But I was a little afraid of experiencing the out-of-body experience. And they must have read my mind, because somebody started talking about how we need to think of an out-of-body experience, not of getting out of my body, but going from one part of my body to another part. So now, instead of me being inside my body, I thought, well, maybe the body is inside of me, and I'm extended. And then the third part, I mean, there were many other things that struck me, but the third really aha moment was in the late 1990s, when I was still living down in the Los Angeles area, and Stephen Hawking was invited to give a talk at Caltech. And I was very excited. It was December, but I came down with about the worst case of flu, except for this past winter, that I've ever had, and couldn't go to his Caltech lecture. But there was a really wonderful science reporter for the Los Angeles Times, and she attended Hawking's talk. And one of the things she wrote was he used a kind of cosmic koan, if you like, to describe the universe. He said the universe was finite, but with no boundaries. And I thought, wow, that's it for what I am, what the I is. That here we are as individuals, and in some way we think of ourselves, and clearly we are finite beings, but where is our boundary? Where do we end? And if this biofield idea is right, now the devices are sensitive enough to pick up the field at, say, a few feet. But as the devices get more and more sensitive, we're going to be able to not only find these biofields, as Chinese medicine tells us, around each of the tissues and organ systems, but who knows how far out we're going to extend.
You know, this may be a good place to ask you about Eileen McCusick, who we've interviewed before. I know you guys have some relations. Is her concept of biofield memory that you mentioned in the lecture as well, and perhaps any correlation it may have to Sheldrake's morphic field concept? Yes,
fascinating. Thanks for reminding me about Eileen. She came to Chi, as a number of practitioners have done, but Eileen came to Chi and she said, I have several decades experience of working with a tuning fork. So she's a New Englander, of course, so she activates the tuning fork on a hockey puck. And she goes, boom, and she hears the sound. And then, she uses the term combing the field. So her client will be on a massage table, and she'll start at one of the chakras, and she'll activate the tuning fork, and then she'll move outwards, perpendicular from the chakra, out from the body. And she listens, and she detects perturbations in that sound. And not only does she detect these perturbations, but first what she does is she measures the edge of the field. And the edge of the field is usually, by her way of doing it, around 6 or 7 feet. So 70 to 80 inches, let's say, is the edge of the field. So if she detects a perturbation at 20 inches out and the edge of your field is 80 inches, that's 1/4 of your lifespan. So she believes that perturbation is health information, health memory that's stored that happened to you at 1/4 of your age, or roughly at age 20. So it's sort of like tree rings where these perturbations are, and she detects major and minor perturbations at many of the chakras, and she uses that to diagnose and also to treat. Oh, sorry, she's not in the medical profession, and they're very careful not to use the term diagnose. So she says she does a clinical assessment. I think that's an important distinction. And she came to Chi and she said, I've been doing this. I have all of this clinical work behind me, and I would like to have you develop a device for us, build a device for us, so that I don't have to use the hockey puck. I can dial what frequency I want. I can press a button on the device that will start the sound. The sound will keep going. I won't have to keep activating the fork as the sound dies out. And it will also have a recording system in this device, so that she can record the sound and listen to it later. It won't just go off into the ether. So I said to her, "This is really exciting. This is Star Wars that could someday be done, but it's going to take quite a while, and it's going to be fairly expensive. And if I was approached to as a potential funder, what I would want would be some proof of concept, some kind of research studies that were done in a controlled manner to show that you're really detecting health-related information." So what I helped to design for her was a study where I said, you come to our lab in San Diego and bring 2 other practitioners who you've trained and have confidence in, and we'll bring in 4 or 6 clients that you haven't seen before. And what I want to see is, do all 3 of you working sequentially on each of these clients, do you detect perturbations at the same site? And so this is what we're working on. The first study we did, ironically, was too difficult to analyze the results because we got too much data. We got too many perturbations, so it was very difficult to say which one corresponded among the 3 practitioners. So we're now setting up to do a larger study with her again, where we're asking them to detect the 3 to 5 strongest perturbations at each site. So it's very exciting, and it's certainly mind-blowing, as we used to say, or paradigm-shifting, potentially, as we now say. That information about our health history is not just stored in the body. I mean, Ida Ralph knew that and showed that, and other types of massage therapy therapists have shown that health information is stored. But here, Eileen's work is showing via the tuning fork perturbations that this health history is stored outside of our body, which would be quite amazing. Mm-hmm. So stay tuned, and we should have that study done certainly within 3 to 6 months is what it looks like. We have to get, again, permission to do the study from an ethics review board and then set it all up. So I guess one of the things that in a lighter mood, what I'd like to end when I have a chance to give these kind of informal talks, is that I know many of your listeners will be old enough to remember what hi-fi was, and certainly everybody knows what Wi-Fi is, but I like to now talk about the biofield as Bi-Fi. So we're going from hi-fi to Wi-Fi to Bi-Fi as ways of listening and storing and maybe even sharing information as a progression. So I guess I would leave you with saying, may the biofield be with you. And it's just a very exciting area of research. It's very difficult to get funding for it, obviously, with funding being cut back at every level of the NIH, of national funding. We are, at QI, at the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, doing what a lot of people are doing in addition to seeking private donors to support this research. We're looking to crowdfunding and other sources from sister organizations who've been very supportive to us. IONS has been very supportive of us. The Chopra Foundation has been very supportive of QI, because we consider ourselves not as a large-scale organization that's going to compete, if you like, with IONS, but we call ourselves a collaborative accelerator. So when we have a particular idea we want to study, we can contact people from all of these other sister organizations that may not have enough people of a critical mass in their organization to do these studies. But we serve as a node to bring the few people together from academia or from other private foundations or organizations to focus on a particular project.
Dr. Hammerschlag, can you tell us about is there other research that you guys are currently working on that you're excited about?
Well, one of our general approaches as we look through the published literature in areas related to biofield is there are a number of tantalizing studies that what the British say are one-offs. They've been done one time. Nobody has, for whatever reason, financial or the group has dissipated and gone off to other things. Nobody has followed up on these studies. And one of those kinds of studies that I mentioned were finding specific response elements on the DNA so that electromagnetic fields can up or down regulate genes. Another kind of study which is fascinating was also done at the Heart Math Institute, where they're finding that when you have two people who are bonded by family or they're married, two people who have a strong relation to each other, with time, they find that one person's aspects of one person's ECG can influence the other person's EEG. So the heart, again, the electromagnetic frequencies, in particular the magnetic field of the heart, is so strong that it can actually entrain or affect other people's fields. So that's another fascinating thing. So what we want to do at QI is to identify these one-off studies that need replication to see if they can, in fact, be reproduced and extended. One of these areas that we hope we're not tilting at windmills is the phantom leaf phenomenon. There was evidence way back from the 60s that in the early days of the use of Kirlian photography, where you could take a freshly cut leaf and get a kind of photograph of the leaf, except the photograph is not done with light. It's done with a type of electromagnetic radiation. And the exciting aspect of those studies, those early studies, was if you tear off one cusp of the leaf and then take another photograph, you still see the whole outline of the leaf. That there is some kind of what we might now call biofield that surrounds a living system. And people are trying in our group now. We have a group of people, again, pulled from academia who are willing in their spare time and their downtime in their labs to try to replicate the phenomena of the phantom leaf. Again, it would be quite necessary to expand our biomedical view of the body to think that there are such biofields that surround the body that, in effect, if that body part is an amputee, for example, might have a whole biofield of the arm, or a missing finger might still be there. And what that says in terms of normal function is quite interesting. So those are the kinds of studies that we're beginning to do. I mean, Chi is only 3 years old so far, and research takes quite a while. We're also interested in a very strong educational outreach, because we're getting groups together to spin their wheels to think, what would it be like if we had a kind of what we could call a biofield sociology? What are the implications both for health and for how we interact with each other in society if we knew that there were biofields that surrounded us?
I wonder if I can ask you just one more question, which is about the mitochondria and its role in the biofield, or little b biofield, and what you can tell us about this.
Well, the original studies on biophotons were done with mitochondria. And most of mainstream science, when they saw these studies, I would say not so much poo-pooed them, but dismissed them as the biophoton emission was real, but they were just normal byproducts of metabolism and had no role itself. Sort of like sparks when a metal rail, a wheel on a train sends off these sparks. So they have no real, they're just a byproduct of metal on metal. And it was thought that they were just byproducts from the mitochondria until people started doing these kinds of experiments of separating cells and looking at mitochondrial production of biophotons, which they can increase under certain metabolic conditions, and show that, again, it doesn't seem to be, a chemical interaction between sets of cells, but the biophoton seems to be the information carrying vehicle, so that they're more than just metabolic byproducts or waste products, if you like.
And so we're at the work of Van Wyck and Pop again.
Yes, yes. And there have been, over the years, there have been a number of papers starting with mitochondria and then with ATP and various other molecules of saying, this is what chi is, and this is what chi is, and chi is mitochondria and metabolic energy. And I just having thought about it a lot and being immersed in Chinese medicine, for a time, as well as Western medicine. I just think there's different vocabularies, and we need to stop trying to force one view on top of the other. They just may not have correspondences. They may not have meaningful correlates.
Well, Dr. Hammerschlag, thank you for your time. And before we sign off, give us the Chi information and how folks can learn more about your organization.
Sure. When we were looking for a URL, we were told that .org is getting maxed out, and maybe we'd like to look at some other extensions. And one of them on the short list we were given was .is. So we thought, how great would that be? would be our website. So you can find us simply at www.chi.is. And the first thing we did actually as an organization was to convene a workshop where we invited about 30 different researchers and scholars on all different aspects of the biofield perspective. So we had people who were experts on traditional spiritual practices and Eastern religions who described different levels of energy surrounding the body. We brought in, right at the other end of the spectrum, of theoretical physicists who now call themselves cosmologists, who are working on views of consciousness as being the ground substance of the universe, of consciousness not being something that simply develops when you have a certain level of complexity and evolution in the nervous system, but that consciousness may, in fact, even be something that drives evolution. So we had, at one end, the spiritual traditions, at the other end, the physicists, and between those we had experts on biofield devices, on people who have done clinical trials with tissue culture cells, with animals, with humans. So we had a whole range, and we wound up writing 12 so-called white papers, position papers, different perspectives on the biofield. And a journal called Global Advances in Health and Medicine was willing to publish these 12 papers as a special issue at the end, which they did at the end of 2015. And anyone who joins Chi through the website, it's a very nominal monthly amount. I can't remember offhand, sorry, what it is. But you will get electronic access to all of these 12 white papers. And even if you don't join Chi, there's a large amount of videos and informational material and monthly blogs related to consciousness and healing. So all of that can be accessed at www.chi.is. Chi is. Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate it.